I asked you what the greatest maritime disaster is, many of you would tell me the sinking of the Titanic. A giant ship, and the victims were in the thousands. This is the greatest maritime disaster. There's no doubt about it. But unfortunately, the answer is wrong. The victims of the Titanic ship were mostly from the Velvet Bourgeois class. That's why the whole world knows this story, and everyone remembers it. But let's assume that the victims of the Titanic were from the downtrodden working class. The world would not have remembered this disaster, and many films would not have been made about it. This is exactly what happened with the disaster of the ship deadliest, whose victims were 3 times more than the Titanic. But unfortunately, nobody knows about this disaster, and many of you have never heard of it. Even the news and press don't talk about it at all. They don't care, because unfortunately, the victims were from the poor class. December 20, 1987, off the coast of the Philippines a ship, the deadliest, was docked, and in front of it were many passengers who began boarding the ship one after another, until we reached 3 passengers inside the ship. This was the maximum number of passengers allowed on this ship. It wasn't possible to take more than that. It was built to carry this number of passengers, but unfortunately, the ship's crew, who were quite careless, did this. They saw a huge crowd of passengers waiting in front of the ship, and everyone wanted to travel. And that's where the biggest favoritism and nepotism in history would begin. Any passenger who gave the crew a bribe was allowed to board. It kept going like this, taking crumpled bills until they reached 4,120 passengers who all boarded the ship. Its limit is 1,423, meaning 2,627 passengers over the ship's capacity. I remember this detail very well. A dark disaster with that night the deadliest ship would depart. And that's when a journey that wouldn't be a normal trip would begin, because the ship would leave the port and never return. As the journey began, the ship would start struggling at sea due to the excess weight of carrying over 40,120 passengers. On top of that, the ship's crew, who were a bunch of failures at night, they started the trip at 10:15. The captain of the ship would get completely drunk. A dark disaster. When his crew sees him drunk, they'll tell him, "This is shameful. At least invite us." And they too would get completely drunk. Everyone was partying. Literally, the trip's outcome was clear from the start. The ship was just sailing on prayers, and on top of that, the whole crew, including the captain, were passed out too. And furthermore, as you know, troubles never come alone. One after the other. Troubles don't whisper. All these problems would be added to by another problem, which is the weather that was unsuitable. The weather was very cloudy, and the fog was extremely dense. Visibility was unclear, and the weather was cold. And on top of that, this ship was moving at a very high speed. Besides being an old and dilapidated ship, it was also carrying more than its capacity. Because of the insane speed, the cloudy weather, poor visibility, and the crew and captain being drunk, the ship would drift off its course and enter another path. Unfortunately, the other path had a tanker full of oil called the Vector, which was on its own course, and he would be surprised by a massive ship heading straight for it. And there, the captains of both the deadliest and the Vector didn't have enough time to react, and unfortunately, a direct collision would occur. The deadliest would hit the Vector ship that was loaded with oil. Due to the collision, the oil that was in the Vector tanker would start leaking entirely. And right then and there, a fire would ignite. Due to the massive amount of oil, a gigantic fire broke out. All the passengers on the deadliest had no other choice. The sea was in front of them and the fire was behind them. The people who chose to jump into the sea didn't have an easy choice, because the sea was cold and freezing. And the people who stayed on the ship, of course, didn't have an easy choice either, because the ship was ablaze. What could they stay? And you might say to me, "Wait a second, Osama, hold on a bit. The ship has lifeboats, and it has life jackets, and it has this and that." See? But the ship, the deadliest, was a wreck, a decrepit ship, and overcrowded too. The crew that was supposed to handle the rescue mission needed rescuing themselves. There were 4,120 passengers on board. They had no other solution but to jump into the sea and die frozen by the cold, or stay on the ship and die burned by the fire. After more than 12 hours, the rescue ships would finally arrive. Why did they arrive so late? Because simply put, our captain and his crew were all drunk. Good on the crew that was on watch, and they were the ones who had to send a distress signal and provide the coordinates at sea so the rescue could come quickly. But unfortunately, the crew did not do their job, and the rescue teams would arrive more than 12 hours late. Keep in mind that Danya Pa's ship had not traveled far from the port, only 30 minutes sailing before they had the accident and sank. When the rescue team arrived, they were in shock. My goodness, they would see thousands of victims in front of them. At that moment, they said to themselves, at most, there would probably be 19 vitted victims. Because the rescuers knew that the capacity of the Danya Pa's ship was only about 1,490 passengers maximum. Then they started pulling out the victims and counting. 1, 3, 4, 5. They reached 500 victims, and they kept going. They reached 1,000 victims. After that, 1,400 victims. A little more, 2,000 victims. My God, a little more, 2,500, 3,000, 3,500. The little number of victims in the end would be 4,964 victims, and only 24 survivors managed to stay alive. Out of 4,120 passengers, meaning with a simple calculation, the survival rate was less than 1%. The rescue team didn't understand anything. They were in total shock. Where did all these people come from? Was it possible the ship was carrying with the 4,000 passengers after this disaster? One of the survivors would tell them what he saw with his own eyes. He would tell them, I saw the sea burning all around me. People were screaming everywhere. I couldn't save anyone. I just swam away from the flames until I lost consciousness. And this was the greatest maritime disaster in human history. Yet this story is unknown to many people. But the majority know the story of the Titanic, which happened in 1912, and its victims numbered 1,100. And on top of that, there were 710 survivors, meaning with a simple calculation, 32% of the Titanic's passengers stayed alive. Well, for the Donut Pass, less than 1% of its passengers stayed alive. And yet we find that everyone knows and has heard of the Titanic disaster. But very few people have heard of the Donut Pass. And the same thing happens a lot in the sea. Because the sea is a true terror, much more than you expect. No matter how much man evolves and how much technological power he gains, he will never be able to handle the sea. The sea and the oceans are a true terror.